What kind of warrior ties his own blood brother to a tree and slowly tears out his ribs one by one while he is still alive? Who forces a traitor's wife and children to participate in his public torture, forcing them to throw stones at the man they once loved? What kind of Viking leader transforms a traitor's execution into a 3-day festival where the entire tribe competes to see who can inflict more pain before death? Imagine you are in 9th century Norway. It is midday and you hear screams coming from the center of the village. When you approach, you see a man nailed upside down to a wooden cross, with his back opened and ribs torn out, forming bloody wings. Around him, hundreds of Vikings celebrate as if it were a religious festival. The man is still alive, and this is no accident. It is tradition. They sold you the image of the Viking as an honored warrior who protected his companions above all else. They told you about codes of honor, unwavering loyalty, blood brotherhood forged in battle. They showed you movies where Vikings die heroically for their brothers in arms, where betrayal is the stuff of weak cowards. But they never told you that the Vikings themselves created execution methods so brutal that they made medieval inquisitors look like amateurs. The truth is that in Viking society, being accused of treason did not just mean death. It meant becoming a public example of what happened to those who broke the sacred bonds of tribal loyalty. And this example had to be so terrifying that no one would ever consider repeating the mistake. We are talking about a culture where betrayal was not just a crime against individuals, but blasphemy against the gods themselves. Vikings believed that Odin personally observed each traitor's execution, and that brutal methods of death ensured that the traitor's soul would never find rest in Valhalla. You know some famous executions in history, but nothing compares to what the Vikings did to members of their own tribe who betrayed them. They developed death rituals that combined extreme physical torture with total spiritual humiliation, ensuring that the traitors suffered not only at the moment of death, but for all eternity. The blood eagle was just one of the methods. Vikings had an entire collection of execution techniques, specific to different types of betrayal. Betraying military secrets resulted in one type of death. Betraying the location of treasures resulted in another. Betraying a leader's trust resulted in the most brutal method of all. Imagine discovering that the warrior who fought beside you for years, who saved your life in battles, whom you considered a brother, sold information about your clan to enemies. The rage you would feel would be nothing compared to the collective fury of an entire tribe that discovered it had a serpent in its midst. For centuries, historians softened accounts of Viking punishments, focusing only on the heroic aspects of Nordic culture. They hid records that revealed that the society that produced some of the bravest warriors in history also developed some of the most creative and sadistic torture methods ever documented. The Icelandic sagas themselves, written by descendants of the Vikings, describe traitor executions in such graphic detail that some manuscripts were censored by Christian monks who considered the content excessively disturbing to preserve. And it worked perfectly as a deterrent. The documented rate of betrayal in Viking societies was practically zero, not because they were naturally more loyal, but because everyone knew exactly what would happen if they were discovered. The fear of punishment was so intense that it created loyalty through terror, because Viking traitor executions were not just about killing the guilty party. They were about sending a message to the entire tribe, to neighboring tribes, and even to the gods themselves. They were demonstrations of power that established that certain lines could never be crossed. And now you will discover exactly what these methods were. Specific torture techniques that were applied according to the type of betrayal, rituals that involved the entire community in punishment, and the religious aspects that transformed executions into sacred ceremonies dedicated to Odin. What I will reveal to you in the next few minutes is not in the movies that romanticize Viking culture. It is documented in the original Norse sagas, in archaeological excavations that found physical evidence of these rituals, in accounts by Christian missionaries who were horrified by what they witnessed. Because the truth about what Vikings did to traitors is not just medieval history. It is a revelation about how societies based on absolute loyalty deal with those who break the fundamental codes that keep the group united, and about how far human beings are capable of going when they feel that their very survival has been threatened by the betrayal of someone they trusted. To understand how betrayal became the most unforgivable crime in Viking society, you need to know Björn, Ironside, legendary son of Ragnar Lothbrok, leader of one of the most powerful tribes in Sweden between 860 and 890, who established the punishment protocols for traitors that spread throughout medieval Scandinavia. Björn was not just a brutal warrior, he was a political strategist who understood that his tribe's survival depended on the absolute loyalty of each member. In a society where information about attack routes, treasure locations, and military alliances could determine the difference between prosperity and total extermination. The codification of punishment rituals for traitors happened in the summer of 872, when Björn discovered that Einar Thorson, one of his most trusted warriors and sworn blood brother, had sold information about a planned attack to a rival Danish tribe in exchange for gold and a promise of protection. This was the reality of Viking politics. Trust was literally a matter of life and death. A single traitor could cause the death of hundreds of warriors and the enslavement of their families. For Björn, Einar had not just broken a personal oath. He had threatened the existence of the entire tribe. Einar had been raised since childhood in Björn's house. They had fought side by side in dozens of battles. Björn had saved Einar's life at least 3 times, and Einar had reciprocated on other occasions. When the betrayal was discovered, Björn's personal pain transformed into tribal fury that demanded public satisfaction. But this was just the beginning. Einar's execution could not be just a quick death. It had to be a blot drap, a sacrificial death that demonstrated to the entire tribe, to enemy tribes, and to the gods themselves, that certain violations of sacred codes resulted in consequences that transcended physical death. Björn's summoned the entire tribe to witness Einar's public trial. For 3 days, evidence of the betrayal was presented publicly. Intercepted letters, witnesses who confirmed secret meetings, and the Danish gold itself found hidden in Einar's house. Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic historian who documented Viking traditions in the 13th century, recorded that Björn established legal precedents that transformed traitor executions into religious ceremonies where the entire community participated in spiritual purification through sacred violence. But the most disturbing aspect was not just the brutality of the execution. It was how Björn religiously justified these practices. He preached that Odin had personally revealed that traitors were spiritual Ulfhednar, wolves disguised as men who needed to be eliminated in a special way to prevent them from contaminating other souls. Björn created a specific 9-step protocol for executing traitors. First step: public exposure of evidence for 3 days. Second, official renunciation of all kinship and friendship ties with the traitor. Third, ritual removal of all weapons and status symbols the traitor had earned. The remaining 6 steps involved the execution itself, but following methods that ensured maximum suffering while keeping the traitor alive for as long as possible. The goal was not just to kill Einar. It was to make him such a terrifying example that no one would ever consider betraying the tribe. Snorri documented that Einar's execution lasted from sunrise to sunset of a single day, but was divided into carefully planned phases that included rest periods where the condemned was kept conscious to fully experience each new form of torture. The specific method chosen for Einar was an elaborate version of the blood eagle. His ribs were broken and torn out one by one, forming wings that symbolized his transformation into a cursed creature. But before that, Björn applied torture techniques that aimed to break not just the body, but Einar's soul. For hours, Einar was forced to publicly confess every detail of his betrayal, including motivations, methods used to communicate with enemies, and future plans he might have developed. Each confession was followed by a new form of mutilation that symbolically corresponded to the type of betrayal revealed. Snorri recorded that Björn had studied torture methods from multiple cultures combining Roman, Frankish, and even Byzantine techniques to create a punishment system that was simultaneously effective for extracting information and terrifying as a public spectacle. Einar's execution became legendary among Viking tribes, not just for the brutality of the methods, but for what happened afterward. No member of Björn's tribe was ever discovered betraying again. Einar's example functioned as an absolute deterrent for generations, but this was just the beginning. The specific methods developed by Björn for Einar's execution were not just random torture. They were an applied science of pain that combined precise anatomical knowledge with religious symbolism to create suffering that lasted as long as possible without causing premature death. The traditional blood eagle began by tying the traitor face down against a sacred tree dedicated to Odin. With a sharp blade, the executioner made a deep incision along the spine, separating the skin from the back. Then the ribs were broken near the spine and torn out one by one, creating wings that extended to the sides of the body. But Björn had perfected the technique. He discovered that by applying tourniquets to the condemned's arms and legs, he could control blood flow and keep Einar conscious throughout the entire process. Each rib was removed slowly, with calculated pauses, to allow the traitor to fully experience each wave of pain. This was the Viking mentality applied to justice. If a problem required an extreme solution, the solution should be applied with the same technical precision used to forge weapons or navigate oceans. The torture of traitors was a specialized skill that required years of practice to master. During Einar's execution, Björn did not work alone. Every adult member of the tribe was forced to participate directly in the punishment. Men took turns applying physical torture. Women were responsible for keeping the condemned conscious through techniques that included controlled burns and mutilation of extremities. And this was not the worst part. The tribe's children also had specific roles in the ritual. Boys from 10 years old were forced to watch every stage of the execution as part of their education about the consequences of betrayal. Girls of the same age were tasked with collecting the spilled blood in sacred vessels that would be used in later ceremonies. Snorri documented that Einar's family was forced to actively participate in his torture. His wife, Astrid, had to personally cut her husband's fingers. His two sons, 12 and 15 years old, were forced to tear out their father's eyes with special tools provided by Björn. Family participation was not optional. Vikings believed that betrayal contaminated the entire culprit's lineage, and that only by participating in his punishment could the family spiritually purify itself. Refusing meant being marked as an accomplice to the original betrayal, and this was not the worst part. Because during the execution, Björn applied the Eneid, a verbal curse that condemned not just Einar, but all his descendants to the 7th generation. The Eneid was not just words. It was a magical ritual that supposedly ensured that the traitor's soul would never find peace, and that his descendants would carry the mark of dishonor for decades. The Eneid ritual included the systematic destruction of everything that represented Einar's existence. His house was burned. His weapons were broken and buried. His animals were sacrificed. Even trees he had planted were cut down and burned to ensure that no trace of his presence remained on tribal land. Snorri recorded that Björn had developed variations of the blood eagle for different types of betrayal. Traitors who sold military secrets had their tongues cut out before the main execution. Those who betrayed treasure locations had their hands severed and burned before their eyes. And this was not the worst part. Einar's execution officially lasted an entire day, but the complete ritual extended for a week. In the 3 days before death, he was subjected to preparatory forms of torture that aimed to break his mental resistance before physical torture began. Einar was deprived of sleep for 72 hours, forced to remain standing tied to a stake while tribe members took turns shouting in his ears about his betrayal. He was fed only salt water and rotten meat, causing constant diarrhea and vomiting that systematically weakened him. During these 3 preparatory days, Einar was forced to watch the destruction of everything he loved. He saw his house burned, his possessions distributed among other tribe members, and his family publicly humiliated as traitors by association. And this was not the worst part, because on the day of the execution itself, Björn revealed that he had saved the cruelest torture for last. After Einar's ribs were torn out and his wings formed, he was forced to watch while his own wife and children were branded with hot iron with symbols that would identify them as traitors' blood for the rest of their lives. The marks were not just symbolic. They were literally permanent scars burned into each family member's face, ensuring that wherever they went, everyone would immediately know they carried the dishonor of betrayal. It was a sentence of social isolation that would last generations. Snorri documented that Astrid and Einar's children were banished from the tribe immediately after the execution, but, carrying the facial marks, no other tribe would accept them. They were forced to live as outcasts, surviving through begging and theft until eventually dying of hunger and exposure. And this was not the worst part, because what Snorri discovered in the oldest records of Einar's execution revealed that Björn had developed a final phase of the ritual that transcended physical death, a practice that ensured that not even death would free the traitor from his punishment. The final phase of the punishment ritual developed by Björn was the most disturbing of all, the deliberate transformation of the dead traitor into a draugr, a cursed undead that would find no rest in death. It was not just about killing Einar. It was about ensuring that his soul remained eternally tormented as a supernatural warning to future traitors. Immediately after Einar's death, by Blood Eagle, Björn initiated specific rituals to prevent his soul from finding the path to any form of afterlife. The body was deliberately mutilated in ways that violated all Viking funeral traditions, ensuring that Einar could not be accepted in either Valhalla or Hell. The eyes were torn out and burned so that the dead could not see the path to the other world. The tongue was cut out and buried separately to prevent him from pronouncing incantations or asking forgiveness from the gods. The feet were severed and buried upside down, symbolizing that the traitor would walk only toward eternal suffering. Snorri documented that Björn had studied ancient magical traditions to develop the draugr creation ritual. Einar's body was buried in a special tomb built with cursed stones, oriented in the opposite direction to all other tribal graves, and sealed with runic symbols that imprisoned the soul within the decomposing corpse. But the most diabolical aspect was that the draugr was not created just to punish the dead traitor. It was created to torment the living. Vikings believed that traitors transformed into draugr would return as vengeful spirits that would haunt anyone who considered betraying the tribe. And it worked beyond Björn's darkest expectations. Within months after Einar's execution, tribe members began reporting sightings of a shadowy figure wandering the forest during nights, moaning the names of people who had shown signs of disloyalty. Some warriors swore they had seen Einar walking with exposed ribs, searching for new traitors to drag with him to eternal torment. Snorri recorded that the legend of Einar's draugr spread through dozens of Viking tribes, creating a supernatural terror of betrayal that transcended any physical punishment. Warriors preferred to die in battle rather than risk being transformed into cursed undead. But in 924, 52 years after Einar's execution, something happened that would forever change Viking perception of betrayal and loyalty. Björn Ironside's conversion to Christianity was not spiritual, it was practical. He realized that other European kingdoms were uniting specifically to exterminate the Vikings because of practices like the deliberate creation of draugr and extreme torture. Rituals. The very barbarity that made his tribe feared was uniting all of Christian Europe against them. King Harald Bluetooth, Björn's political successor, ordered the immediate end of all draugr creation practices, not out of compassion, but out of strategic necessity. The Vikings needed Christian allies to survive politically, and the undead rituals had become an insurmountable barrier to any alliance. The transition was violent and revealing. Hundreds of Vikings who refused to abandon extreme punishment traditions were killed by their own leaders. Draugr tombs were excavated, and the bodies burned in Christian bonfires in an attempt to liberate the souls imprisoned by pagan rituals. But the most disturbing aspect of the conversion was discovering that many Vikings preferred the terror of draugr to the uncertainty of the new religion. They had become so dependent on supernatural fear to maintain tribal loyalty that they could not imagine a society based on other principles. And thus ended one of the most systematic and psychologically sophisticated traditions of social control ever developed by any human culture. The punishment rituals for traitors were not abandoned due to moral evolution. They were abandoned due to political necessity when they became inconvenient for the Vikings' own survival. Compassion did not defeat barbarity. Political convenience defeated barbarity. The truth about what Vikings did to traitors reveals something fundamental about social control: that no method is too cruel to be justified when a society believes its cohesion depends on it, and that even the most terrifying traditions disappear instantly when they become politically inconvenient. Björn Ironside did not become more civilized. He discovered that Christian civilization was more useful for political expansion than pagan terror. And when he made this discovery, he abandoned, without hesitation, centuries of tradition that included the deliberate creation of undead as a tool of social control. Viking loyalty was not based on honor or fraternal love. It was based on absolute terror of the consequences of betrayal. When this terror ceased to be socially useful, the very definition of loyalty changed to adapt to new political needs. For centuries, tribal loyalty was portrayed as moral virtue. The reality is that it was a survival tool maintained through methods so extreme that they transformed traitors into literal monsters to terrorize the living.